The smoke was the first thing anyone noticed. It rose thin and pale against the January sky, the color of old iron barely visible above the surface of the snow. From a distance, you might have missed it entirely. Just a thread of gray lifting from a low mound in the earth, something that looked more like a forgotten hill than a place where people lived. The wind that morning was moving at a constant angle across the open Kansas plain, the kind of wind that did not come in gusts but simply stayed a permanent pressure against everything standing. And yet the smoke rose, slowly, steadily, without interruption. Not extinguished, not buried, still there. They had said the ground would not save her. They had said sod walls crumble under frost and that a structure built by a woman alone with no team, no lumber, no real tools to speak of was not a structure at all. It was a delay, a postponement of the inevitable. They had said these things not with cruelty, but with the authority of people who had watched winter on the open plain take what it wanted, without preference and without mercy. They were not wrong, but they were not precise. Because survival on the Kansas plain in the winter of 1892 was not decided by strength. It was not decided by resources or by the size of a woodpile or by how thick your walls were when October arrived. It was decided by something quieter than any of that, something that most people had never thought to measure. And on a morning in late August of that same year, when a 64-year-old woman named Harriet Voss stood beside a wagon that no longer belonged to her, beside a piece of land that held nothing but grass, and when that thing was already alive inside her. She just did not know yet how much she would need it. Her name was Harriet. Everyone who knew her called her Hattie. She had been born in Missouri in 1828, the second of 6 children on a working farm outside of Springfield. She had spent the better part of her life on land that other people built. Her father built the first house she remembered. Her husband, a quiet and methodical man named George Voss, built the next 3. Hattie had raised her children in structures her husband made from timber and earth and careful attention, and she had watched him do it. That is the part that matters. She had watched him, not casually, not the way a person glances at something without meaning to retain it. She had asked questions from the time she was a young woman, small practical questions that George would answer patiently while he worked. Why does the floor slope toward that corner? Why do the roof beams cross at that angle? Why do you pack the lower timbers first before you worry about the upper ones? He would explain, and she would listen, and then the season would pass, and the house would be finished, and she would carry on with the work of living inside it. She was not trained. She had no experience with a hammer or a saw in any serious sense. Her hands had always been occupied with other things, bread and laundry and children, and the long daily maintenance of a household that never fully stopped demanding attention. But she remembered every answer George had ever given her, every principle he had ever explained. It was all still there, stored in some part of her mind that had never been asked to use it, until now. George had died 4 years earlier. Her son Curtis, who had inherited his father's impatience but not his father's steadiness, had filed a homestead claim in western Kansas with the intention of building something from nothing and calling it a future. He had brought Hattie along. He had also brought his 2 children, Amos, who was 9 years old, and Wren, who was 7. Their mother had passed 2 years before, and the children had been in Hattie's keeping since then. Curtis had filed the claim and paid the fee and made plans that he talked about with a confidence that did not require supporting evidence. He was going to build. He was going to farm. He was going to make something of 160 acres of Kansas grassland that currently held nothing but deep-rooted sea and the constant horizontal movement of the wind. He lasted 3 weeks. There had been no argument, no single dramatic moment when everything collapsed. Curtis had simply looked at the work in front of him, looked at what he had available to do it with, and made a calculation. A man came through with word of freighting work in Denver. Good pay, steady through the winter. Curtis could go earn real money, come back in the spring with lumber and supplies, and begin properly. That was how he explained it to Hattie the morning he left. Properly. He took the mule. He took the cash. He took the one advantage they had, which was the animal that made real construction possible. He left the wagon, which was no longer useful without the mule to pull it. He left the shovel rusted at the socket, but still functional. He left the hatchet with the worn handle. He left 3 wool blankets and the cast iron stove they had hauled from Missouri because Hattie had refused to leave it behind. And he left Hattie and Amos and Wren standing beside a wagon that now served as shelter and storage, both on a claim that had been filed and paid for, but built on not at all. It was the last week of August. Hattie stood beside that wagon for a long time after Curtis rode out of sight, long enough for the children to stop watching the horizon and start watching her. Amos stood with his hands at his sides, his face doing the careful work of not showing what he felt. Wren stood closer to her grandmother, not speaking, pressing her shoulder lightly against Hattie's arm, the way a small animal seeks warmth. Hattie looked at the land. 160 acres of western Kansas grassland looked in late August like a promise that had not yet decided what it was promising. The grass was still green at the roots, but drying at the tips, moving continuously in a wind that had no hills to break it and no trees to slow it. The sky above was enormous, the kind of sky that exists only where the land is absolutely flat, where there is nothing to divide the horizon and nothing to remind you that the world has edges. It was in its way a beautiful thing. But beauty on the open plain is not comfort. It is exposure dressed in better light. The first condition was exposure. The second condition was time. Late August meant 6 weeks, perhaps 7, before the cold arrived in any serious form. A month and a half, 45 days at best. Not enough time for a standard construction, even with good tools and working animals and men to help. With what she had, it was not enough time for any construction that followed the rules she knew. So she began not with materials, but with mathematics. Distance to water, distance to usable grass, what she could carry, what the children could carry, how much time each task would consume. She did this silently, walking the land in the evenings while the children slept in the wagon, measuring not with any instrument, but with her eyes and her knowledge of her own body and its limits. Her hands were the problem. Arthritis had settled into her knuckles over the past several years, not severely but consistently. She could grip the shovel handle. She could swing the hatchet, but not for long stretches without rest. Not the way a younger person could. The continuous labor that standard construction required was not available to her. Her body would not cooperate with that approach. But her body was not the only resource she had. It was not even the most important one. She walked the land, and she remembered George's voice, patient and specific, explaining things she had asked about without knowing she would ever need the answers. She thought about the root cellars he had dug in Missouri. Below ground was stable. Below ground was protected on 3 sides before you built a single wall. Below ground meant the earth itself was doing part of your work for you, and if the earth was doing part of your work, then you needed to do less of the rest. That was where she began. Not with the walls, with the ground beneath them. On the 4th day, a man came. He rode in from the east on a gray horse and stopped at a distance that was close enough to assess the situation, but far enough to show he was not certain of his welcome. He was 66 years old or near it, with a face that had been weathered by years of Kansas weather into something angular and careful. His name was Edmund Hale, and he had a homestead claim 2 miles north that he had been working for 3 years. He sat on his horse and looked at the wagon and the children and the woman with the rusted shovel standing in the grass. His expression did not change. He had already done whatever calculating he needed to do. He rode in closer and dismounted. "You planning to build?" he said. It was not quite a question. It was closer to an inventory of what he saw in front of him. "Yes," Hattie said, with what he said. She did not answer immediately. The answer was not a list of materials. The answer was something harder to explain to a man who measured possibility by what he could see. He walked the ground without being invited to. He pressed his boot heel into the sod and watched it hold dense and rooted and layered with the interlocked root systems of 40 years of unbroken grassland. He looked at the shovel. He looked at the children. He looked at the sky to the northwest, which was the direction winter came from. "You'll need a plow," he said, "and a team to pull it. I have neither. Then you'll need men. I have none." He looked at her then longer than he had before. Not with contempt, with something more complicated than contempt. The look of a man who understands a problem completely and is not certain what to do with that understanding. "You won't finish," he said. "No one does alone." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Half a wall is worse than none," he said without turning back around. "Half a system fails faster than no system at all." He mounted his horse and rode back toward the north. Hattie watched him go. She did not feel discouraged. She did not feel reassured. She felt informed, and information, regardless of what it contains, is always more useful than silence. That night, she made a decision. She would not build what a person was supposed to build on a homestead claim in 1892. A standard structure required lumber and a team and men and time and tools she did not have. She would build instead for what she had, which was knowledge and a shovel, and 2 children in 40 days. She would build within the constraint, not against it. The next morning she began digging, not laying the first block of sod, not cutting the first timber, digging. 2 feet down, first pressing the shovel in with her boot working slowly and steadily because steady was what her hands allowed. Then 3 feet. The excavation was not wide, not yet. She was establishing a space first because space defines everything that follows. If you know the space precisely, everything else is a response to it. If you do not know the space, everything else is a guess. Amos and Wren carried the displaced soil away in small loads. They were not efficient. They were 9 and 7 years old, and they carried what 9 and 7-year-olds can carry, which is not much. But they were continuous. They did not stop. In continuity, when time is the resource you are most short of, matters more than speed. By the end of the third day, the outline existed, not a house, a cavity, protected on 3 sides by the earth itself. That single fact changed the arithmetic of everything else. 3 walls already standing, 3 walls she did not need to build. The exposure reduced before the first sod block was placed. The failure points reduced before the first decision about roofing needed to be made. Then she cut the first block. The shovel blade went into the grass at a shallow angle, undercutting the root mass rather than breaking through it. The block came up intact, heavy with soil, held together by the dense web of grass roots that had been growing and interlocking and tightening for decades. She looked at it for a moment before she placed it. This was the thing George had explained to her once on a morning in Missouri when she had asked him about the sod houses she had read about on the plains. "It is not the dirt," he had said. "Dirt alone is just dirt. It is the roots. The roots turn the soil into something that holds itself together. Take the grass roots, you take the structural integrity with them." She placed the block with the grass side down, roots facing inward. The next block went beside it, the same orientation. Then another. The first row was uneven and imperfect, but it was there, and it established something more important than form. It established process. Amos watched her work from a few feet away, quiet in the way he had been quiet since Curtis left. Not sad, something more like alert. He was a boy who noticed things. "Grandma," he said, "where did you learn to build?" She stopped. She looked at her hands. The knuckles were swollen at the joints the way they always were in the morning, and she had been working for 2 hours. They ached in the steady, manageable way that she had become accustomed to managing. "I never built anything," she said. "I only remembered what I watched." He thought about that. Then he picked up a piece of displaced sod from the pile beside him and carried it to the base of the growing wall without being asked. She watched him do it. Then she went back to cutting. What she did not tell him, because she had not yet found the words for it, was what she was actually doing when she answered his question. She was accessing something that no one had known to take from her. Curtis had taken the mule and the money, the visible and portable advantages. But there is a kind of knowledge that cannot be loaded onto a horse and ridden away. It lives in the accumulated attention of decades, in the 10,000 small questions she had asked George over 40 years of marriage, in the answers she had stored without knowing they were being stored the way a person absorbs a language by living inside it long enough. She had spent her whole life watching how things were made. She had just never been the one who had to make them. By the end of the first week, the walls rose 1 foot above the excavated ground, 5 feet total from the floor. Not tall by any standard, but continuous. The continuity was what mattered. Breaks in a wall are not just aesthetic failures. They are structural ones. A break means a path. A path means movement. Movement means loss, and loss in the winter on the open plain is not recoverable once it gets ahead of you. Edmund returned on the 8th day. He stood at the edge of the excavation and looked down into it, then at the walls, then at Hattie. "You're building low," he said. "Yes, you'll flood. Water moves across this ground in spring." She pointed to the floor of the excavation without speaking. He looked more carefully. There was a slight and deliberate angle cut into the earth, barely perceptible, running from the back wall toward the entrance. Water would not collect. It would move directed away from the interior before it could pull. He was quiet for a moment. "You still won't finish," he said. "I will finish enough," she said. He looked at her. He had spent 3 years on the Kansas plain, and he knew exactly what enough meant in that context. It was not a comfortable word. It was not an aspirational word. It was a precise and clinical word that meant exactly the threshold between surviving and not surviving, and not 1 degree beyond that threshold. He turned and walked back toward his horse. Then he stopped the way he had stopped before. "Half a wall is worse than none," he said again. "I know," she said. "You told me." He mounted and rode north. Hattie went back to cutting sod. The second week moved faster because process had been established. Her hands had found the rhythm that her arthritis would allow, and she had learned to work in intervals. 40 minutes with the shovel, 15 minutes of rest. During the rest, she would direct the children, sorting blocks, checking the base of the existing walls for evenness, carrying water from the creek a quarter-mile east. The walls reached 3 feet above ground, 8 total from the floor. Not tall enough to stand inside without stooping. She did not need to stand, she needed to survive, and survival has different spatial requirements than comfort. The roof was the part she had been thinking about since before she started the walls. It was the part she could not solve with the shovel or the hatchet. A roof requires something to span the space. Usually that meant timber. She had no timber within any practical distance. The nearest trees were the willows along the creek bed, 2 miles out, thin and flexible, and not particularly strong. She had been turning this problem over in her mind for 2 weeks before she arrived at something George had once mentioned, almost incidentally, about the way archways distribute weight. A flat surface holds weight at its center, where pressure concentrates. A curved surface moves weight toward the edges, where the supporting structure is. The arch had been solving this problem for human beings for several thousand years. She did not need to invent anything. She only needed to remember. She cut the willow saplings one at a time and carried them back one at a time because one at a time was what she could manage. 2 miles out, 2 miles back, 1 sapling per trip for 3 days. Amos came with her on the second day and carried his own smaller, which reduced the number of trips needed. She bent the first sapling across the space of the excavation, anchoring each end deep into the sod wall. It held. She bent a second one beside it, then a third. Each arch sharing the load with the one beside it, each reducing the stress on the next. The frame was weak in its individual pieces and strong in its collective arrangement, which is true of most things that hold under pressure. She covered the frame with dry grass first, then loose soil in a thin and even layer. Not thick, not heavy, enough to provide insulation without adding a weight the arches could not distribute. Balance mattered more than thickness because too thin and the wind would take it, and too heavy and the structure itself would fail under the load. Inside, she lined the walls with dry grass, then with cloth, then with every layer she could find. Not for warmth directly, for stillness. Still air holds heat. Moving air carries it away. The goal was to create a space where the air did not move, where heat generated by a small fire would slow its departure rather than exit quickly. The system was not about producing more warmth. It was about reducing how fast warmth disappeared. By early October, the structure was complete enough. Not finished by any standard she would have recognized before this autumn. There were gaps that would need attending to. The roof was imperfect. The door was a hanging blanket weighted at the bottom with stones from the creek bed. But the walls stood and the roof curved above them, and the floor was 3 feet below the surface of the Kansas plain, which meant the earth itself held 3 sides of the structure in a grip that the wind could not reach. She moved the children inside on a Thursday evening, not because the structure was ready, but because the time for preparation had ended. The first cold of the season had arrived 2 days before, not severe, but present. A reminder that the window she had been working inside was closing, and that closing windows do not wait for readiness. She lit the stove for the first time inside the structure. The air held, not warm, not comfortable in any way that the word is usually meant, but stable. Inside and outside had become different places, which was the entire purpose of every block she had cut, and every willow she had carried, and every morning she had risen before the children to press dirt into the gaps in the walls, before the day's light made the work visible to anyone who might ride past. Edmund came again that evening. He stood at the entrance, which was the blanket hanging in the low opening, and he felt the air difference with his face before he said anything. He stepped inside. He stood there for a long moment looking at the walls, then the curved ceiling, then the stove, then Amos and Wren sitting on the blankets spread across the earthen floor. "You built low," he said. "Yes." He looked at the walls. At the sod blocks, roots facing inward rose uneven, but continuous. "You built it different," he said. "I removed what I didn't need to fight," she said. He looked at the entrance, at the floor, at the ceiling. He was doing the inventory of a man who understood construction and was finding in this construction choices he would not have made and reasons he was beginning to understand. Then he looked at her. "You might last," he said. Maybe she said. He stood there a moment longer. Then he walked back out into the October evening. The sound of his horse moving north faded slowly and then was gone. Hattie sat down on the floor of the structure she had built with a rusted shovel and 2 children and 40 years of someone else's explanations, and she listened to the wind moving across the top of the curved roof above her. The sound was different than it had been from inside the wagon. Muffled, reduced, like something heard through a closed door. Not gone, not defeated, reduced. And reduced, she had already begun to understand, was the whole of the project. Not to overcome the winter, not to outwork it or outspend it or outlast it through sheer determination. To reduce systematically and deliberately how much of it reached her. Every decision she had made since that first morning with the shovel had been a reduction of some kind. Reduce the surface exposed to wind, reduce the height of the walls that needed to be built, reduce the span the roof needed to cover, reduce the space the air needed to fill. Amos was watching her from across the small, dim interior. She looked at him. "Are we going to be all right?" he asked. She looked at the walls, at the floor, at the curved ceiling above them. She pressed her hand flat against the sod wall beside her and held it there. The wall was cool but not cold. The earth behind it was holding something, stability, temperature, the slow patience of ground that had been accumulating these properties for longer than any of them had been alive. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I know what we have." She looked at the entrance where the blanket hung still in the windless interior air. "We have enough to find out." Amos nodded. He pulled his blanket closer around his shoulders. Wren had already fallen asleep. Outside, the wind moved across the open Kansas plain, without obstruction as it always had, and would for as long as the land stayed flat and the sky stayed wide. It pressed against the earth mound that now existed where there had been only grass. It found no tall surface to push against, no vertical wall to test. It moved over the low curve of the roof and continued south, carrying whatever it had gathered from the north. The smoke from the stove rose through the small opening Hattie had left in the roof's highest point, thin and pale and steady. The structure held. It was the first night of what would be the longest and most demanding winter Harriet Voss had ever passed through. She did not know that yet. She knew only what the wall beneath her hand was telling her, which was that the earth had more patience than the cold, and that she had built close enough to the earth to borrow some of that patience for herself. That was enough. For now, it was enough. The wind changed in the middle of October, not stronger. That distinction mattered, and Hattie understood it before she had the language to explain it. The wind that came off the northern plain in the first weeks of October came in the way wind had always come across that open ground, in movements and pressure and release, gusting, and then easing, testing, and then withdrawing. It had a rhythm to it, an intermittent quality that a person could adapt to because it allowed for the intervals of stillness in between. What arrived in the second week of October had no intervals. It simply stayed. A constant, level, unbroken pressure from the northwest that did not peak and did not rest and did not acknowledge the difference between day and night. It was the kind of wind that reveals things. Intermittent force finds the obvious weaknesses in a structure. Constant pressure finds the rest of them. Hattie discovered this through the fire. She had set the cast iron stove in the center of the interior, close enough to the back wall to reflect heat, but far enough to allow the children to move around it safely. The stovepipe ran up through the opening she had left in the roof, sealed around with packed earth and clay from the creek bed. The fire it produced was small. She had decided from the beginning to keep it small. A large fire consumes fuel at a rate that outpaces what it produces in lasting warmth. A small fire in an enclosed space with limited air movement produces warmth that accumulates. The difference is not in the heat generated, it is in the heat retained. But on the third night of the constant northwest wind, the fire behaved differently. She noticed it before she understood it. The flame that had been rising vertically since the first night inside was now angled. Not dramatically, not extinguished or even struggling, just leaning consistently and without variation toward the south wall of the interior. Hattie sat and watched it for a long time without moving, the way she had watched George work, the way she had always watched things she did not yet fully understand. The flame was not doing something wrong. It was showing her something true. Moving air has direction. Flame follows moving air because it must, because it has no resistance to offer against the pressure of air in motion. If the flame leaned south, air was moving south. If air was moving south inside the structure, it was entering from the north. If it was entering from the north, there was a path. She pressed her palm flat against the north wall and moved it slowly across the surface of the sod blocks. She was not looking for a gap she could see. She was looking for a gap she could feel. A place where the air against her skin was cooler than the surrounding surface. A place where movement existed where there should have been stillness. She found it near the base of the wall, 18 inches from the floor. Not a visible crack, just a seam between two blocks that had been placed in the first week of construction before her process had fully settled into consistency. The blocks on either side were solid. This seam was not. There was a thin channel of air moving through it, no wider than a finger, but continuous. In a sealed space, a continuous channel of any size is enough. Not enough to feel dramatic. Enough to carry heat away at a rate that a small fire cannot replace. She went outside with a bundle of dry grass and a handful of the dense clay-rich soil from the excavation pile. The wind hit her immediately, that flat northwest pressure that had no patience for anything standing in its way. She walked the perimeter of the structure until she was facing the north wall from outside, looking at it from the direction of the problem. She found the seam. From outside, it was barely visible, a hairline difference in the surface of the sod. She packed it with grass, first pressing it in with her fingers, then sealed it with damp clay, pressing until she felt resistance equal to the surrounding wall. Then she went back inside and lit the fire again and sat down and watched the flame. It rose straight. She stayed watching it for 20 minutes to be certain. The flame did not waver. The air inside was still. The path was closed. She had not made the structure warmer. She had made it more controlled. The distinction was not a small one. Warmer implies addition, implies producing something that was not there before. Controlled means the thing that was already present is no longer being lost at the rate it was before. She was not adding heat to the interior. She was reducing the speed at which it left. That difference would determine everything in the months ahead. She began watching the fire every evening with the specific intention of reading it. Not for comfort, not to confirm that it was burning, to understand what it was telling her about the behavior of the air inside the structure. When the flame rose straight, the system was holding. When it leaned, something had changed. The flame was more honest than any instrument she could have bought, and it was always present, and it never stopped reporting. Amos began watching her watch the fire. He did not ask right away. He was a boy who observed before he questioned, which was one of the things about him that reminded her most of George. He sat on his blanket in the evenings after Wren had fallen asleep, and he watched his grandmother watch the flame with the same quality of focused attention that he had never seen adults apply to something so ordinary. After 3 days of this, he asked, "Why do you watch the fire instead of feeling the cold?" She looked at him across the dim interior. The firelight moved across his face, patient and waiting. "Because the fire shows me what I cannot see," she said. He considered this. Then he looked at the fire himself with a new quality of attention, the way a person looks at something after being told it contains information they had not previously noticed. He sat quietly for a long time watching the flame. The next morning he checked the north wall without being told. He pressed his palm against the sod blocks the way she had, moving it slowly across the surface, not knowing exactly what he was looking for, but knowing the method was right. He found nothing new. He came and told her. She nodded and went back to what she was doing. He checked it again the following morning, and the morning after that. She did not instruct him. She did not tell him to keep checking or explain why the checking mattered. He had watched her do it, and he had understood that it was part of the system, and so he made himself part of the system. A 9-year-old boy pressing his palm against a sod wall before breakfast in the middle of the Kansas autumn learning something he would not be able to name for years but would carry for the rest of his life. The rain arrived in the first week of November. It came without the drama of a storm, which made it more dangerous in a practical sense. A dramatic storm announces itself and gives a person time to prepare. This rain simply appeared out of a low gray sky, cold and steady, and driven at a shallow angle by the northwest wind that had not stopped. It moved across the open ground without pooling, which was what Hattie had feared. Standing water sits and waits. Moving water finds entry points. She heard it change sound inside the structure before she felt anything. There was a place above the entrance where the sound of rain on the curved sod roof shifted from a soft and even percussion to something slightly different, a duller quality, a hesitation in the rhythm. She stood and pressed her hand against the ceiling at that point and felt it. Not wetness yet, moisture, the particular coolness of earth that has absorbed water from above rather than simply passing it downward. She went outside into the rain and looked at the roof. The curve was holding. Water was moving off the surface in channels she had anticipated when she built it, running down the sides and away from the walls. But there was one point where the curve had a slight depression, a place where the arch of one willow sapling sat marginally lower than the ones on either side. Not enough to notice in dry conditions. Enough in rain to slow the water's movement and allow it to hesitate and then depress downward through the layers of soil and grass rather than continuing off the side. She did not add more soil to raise the surface. Adding weight to a curved roof that was already carrying its calculated load was a way of solving one problem by creating a larger one. The arches had been designed for the weight they carried. They had not been designed for more. Instead, she removed material. She took a small amount of soil from the depression, reshaping the curve so that water arriving at that point had no reason to pause. The surface now continued its angle without interruption. Water reaching that section would encounter no hesitation, no reason to collect, no moment in which it could begin to find the downward path through the roof material. She went inside and waited. The dripping stopped. She had not blocked the water. She had removed the condition that was causing the water to stop. That distinction had been true of the air channel in the north wall as well. She had not stuffed the gap as a temporary measure. She had packed it to restore the integrity of the wall, to return the wall to a state in which the gap did not exist. Treating symptoms and changing conditions look similar from the outside. They produce very different results over time. The morning after the rain, the interior was dry. Not damp in the way that an imperfect structure holds onto moisture. Dry. She ran her palm across the floor, across the base of the walls, across the ceiling, at the point where she had heard the change in sound. Dry. That told her something more important than the fact that the repair had worked. It told her that the system was sound enough that a single correct adjustment could restore it to full function. A fundamentally flawed structure cannot be fixed by small corrections. A fundamentally sound one can. The structure she had built with a rusted shovel and willow saplings and 40 years of remembered explanation was at its core sound. The northwest wind continued. By mid-November, it had become as constant a feature of the interior life of the structure as the fire itself, not something that could be forgotten or ignored, but something that had been incorporated into the calculations of daily maintenance. Hattie had developed the habit of checking the flame first thing each morning before she added wood before she woke the children. She wanted to know what the night had done before she decided what the morning needed. Most mornings the flame rose straight, the system was holding. But one morning it leaned. Not toward the south wall this time, toward the east, toward the entrance. The blanket that served as a door had been weighted in position to minimize air movement, but the northwest wind at that angle and at that persistence had found a way to push around the weight and create a continuous low movement through the gap at the blanket's edges. Not a dramatic breach, a slow and constant drain. She went outside and looked at the entrance from the perspective of the wind. The opening faced east, which she had chosen deliberately at the beginning of the construction, because it placed the entrance on the side away from the prevailing wind direction. But the wind had been so consistent and so level that it had begun to wrap around the north wall of the structure and find the entrance from a secondary angle. She could not move the entrance. She could not seal it. The entrance was a necessity, but she could change what the wind encountered before it reached the entrance. She built a short wall of sod blocks set at an angle outside the entrance, positioned not to block the wind directly, but to interrupt its path and redirect it. Wind striking a flat surface at a perpendicular angle Must stop and find another way. Wind striking a surface at an angle moves along it and is redirected by it. She set the wall so that the wind coming around the north corner of the structure would hit the angled surface and be turned away from the entrance opening before it could find its way inside. She went back in and watched the flame. It rose straight. Wren had watched her build the wind wall from inside the entrance, peering around the blanket. That evening, without being asked and without announcing what she was doing, Wren took a scoop of ash from the base of the stove and carried it outside and spread it across the earth in front of the entrance. The ground had been freezing at night and thawing incompletely during the day, leaving the surface near the entrance with a slickness that had caused Amos to slip twice while carrying firewood. Hattie watched her do it. She had done the same thing herself the previous week and had not said anything about it to either of the children. Wren had seen her, had understood the reason without having it explained, and had made the task her own. Every morning after that, before the first light was fully established, Wren spread ash from the stove across the entrance path, not because she was told to, because she had seen that it needed doing and had decided she was the one who could do it. Small actions repeated consistently are not small over time. They are the texture of a system that holds. Edmund came back in the third week of November. He arrived at a different time than before, in the late afternoon rather than midday, and he came on foot rather than on horseback, which suggested he had not planned the visit so much as arrived at it. He looked older than he had in October. The weeks of cutting and hauling firewood had added something visible to the way he carried himself, a weight in the shoulders that had not been there before. He stood at the entrance, and Hattie moved the blanket aside and he stepped in. He stood for a moment in the interior, the way he always did, assessing the air before he said anything. This time the assessment took longer. "You're burning less," he said. "Yes." He looked at the small fire in the stove. He was a man who burned twice as much wood to maintain a structure that was larger and above ground and not protected on three sides by the patience of the earth. He was not unaware of this. How he said, "I am not heating what I do not use." He looked at the blanket partition she had strung across one corner of the interior. Behind it were the two sleeping pallets for the children close together, reducing the volume of air that the fire needed to address each night. 3 people generated heat, small amounts, but cumulative amounts, amounts that in a reduced space were not negligible. He looked at the walls, at the roof, at the floor. "Most people add more," he said. "Reducing demand is often more effective than increasing supply," she said. "Because supply runs out. Demand is something you control." He was quiet for a long time. He sat against the wall without being invited to, and he looked at the fire, and he stayed quiet in a way that was not uncomfortable. He was thinking. She could tell the difference between a person who was quiet because they had nothing to say and a person who was quiet because they were working on something. He stayed for an hour. Then he stood and said he needed to get back before the light was entirely gone, and she moved the blanket, and he stepped out into the November evening. She had not asked him about his own situation. She did not need to. She could see it in the way he moved, in the weight in his shoulders, in the fact that he had walked over rather than ridden. The horse was probably needed for hauling wood. He was hauling a great deal of wood. The storm arrived at the end of November. It did not arrive suddenly. Storms of that kind, the ones that settle into the Kansas plain with genuine intention, do not arrive suddenly. They build. The sky changes first, not dramatically, but completely, from the specific blue of autumn to a uniform gray that is not the gray of ordinary clouds, but the gray of a sky that has committed itself entirely to one purpose. Then the wind shifts slightly and the temperature drops, not in a single step, but in a slow and continuous descent that is harder to respond to than a sudden change, because it does not announce a specific moment that demands a specific response. By the second day it was snowing, and the wind had returned to its northwest constancy, driving the snow horizontally so that it accumulated not as much on open ground as against anything vertical it encountered. Against the low profile of the structure, the snow moved mostly over the top and accumulated against the outer walls at the base, which was a thing Hattie watched with more interest than alarm. She had not planned for the snow to behave as she now suspected it might. She had planned only to reduce exposure and reduce loss and maintain balance between what the fire produced and what the structure allowed to escape. But on the second night of the storm, she noticed something. The wind sound inside the structure had changed. Not diminished because the wind had slowed. The wind had not slowed. diminished because the snow against the outer walls had begun to act as an additional layer of material between the interior and the pressure outside. Snow is not warm, but still material of any kind reduces air movement. Reduced air movement reduces the rate at which heat travels from a warmer space to a colder one. The snow that was accumulating against the outer walls of the structure, the snow she had not planned for and had not built for, was making the structure more efficient. She kept this observation to herself for a day. Then the storm continued into its third day, and then its fourth, and the wind did not ease, and the snow did not stop, and the temperature outside the structure dropped to a cold that Hattie could feel in her knuckles even inside a deep and fundamental cold that was not the cold of autumn, but the cold of winter fully committed. It was on the fourth day that Edmund came. She heard him before she saw him, not his voice, his movement, a particular sound of effort and resistance outside the entrance, the sound of someone who has been walking through deep snow for longer than they should have needed to. She moved the blanket aside before he knocked. He was standing at the entrance with snow on his coat that had stopped being new snow and become part of the fabric. His face had the specific expression of a man who has made a decision that cost him something to make. He was not injured. He was not dramatically distressed. He had simply reached the edge of what his system could manage without assistance. A section of his roof had failed under the weight of accumulated snow. Not the entire structure. A section. But a section was enough. Cold does not require a large opening. It requires only that the interior and exterior are no longer two different places. She stepped back from the entrance. He came in. She did not offer anything, and he did not ask for anything. He sat near the stove, without touching it, close enough to feel the heat, and far enough to demonstrate that he was not desperate for it. He sat and looked at the interior of the structure with the eyes of a man who was experiencing it differently than he had on any previous visit. He had spent 4 days fighting the storm from inside a structure that was now partially open to it. He had burned wood at a rate that the storm's duration was beginning to strain. He had worked continuously to maintain what he had built, and the storm had found the weakness in it anyway. Here inside the low earth structure that a 64-year-old woman with arthritic hands had built with a rusted shovel in less than 6 weeks, the air was still. The fire was small and steady. The children were asleep. He sat for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Amos, who was awake and watching him from across the interior. Amos was not watching him with curiosity. He was watching him with the same quality of attention he had been developing for 2 months, the observational attention that his grandmother had modeled without ever explicitly teaching. He was watching Edmund the way he watched the fire each evening, gathering information, trying to understand what the presence of this particular man in this particular state was telling him about the nature of the situation outside. Edmund noticed the way the boy was watching him. He looked from the boy to Hattie and back to the boy, and something shifted in his expression that was not quite recognition but was close to it. "You did not teach him," he said to Hattie. "No," she said. "He watches the way you watch." She was quiet. He thought about this. He was thinking about the difference between instruction and transmission, between telling a person how to do something and allowing a person to absorb how to do something by being present while it is done. He had raised his own children through the first method, explaining and demonstrating and correcting. He was looking at a boy who had learned something through the second method without either of them having chosen it. "You are building something else," he said, "not just the walls." She looked at her hands, then at Amos, then at the small, steady flame. "I am doing what I know how to do," she said. "He is doing what he sees." Edmund was quiet again. The storm continued outside. The wind pressed against the outer walls and found the snow it had packed against them, and pressed against that too and found resistance. The fire did not grow. The space inside the blanket partition remained warm enough. Not comfortable, not the warmth of a proper house in a proper winter, but a warmth that held, sufficient, controlled, enough. On the fifth day, the storm eased, not all at once. The way the wind had settled in without a single dramatic moment, it now withdrew without one. The snow thinned. The gray of the sky lightened by increments that were too small to mark individually, but that accumulated across the hours of the afternoon into something noticeably different by evening. By the next morning, the wind had dropped to something that felt by comparison almost gentle. Edmund stood outside the entrance and looked at the landscape that the storm had reordered. Drifts where there had been flat ground, paths that no longer existed. The structure itself was almost invisible from 50 yards out, just a low curve of snow-covered earth, with a thin line of a stovepipe emerging from the center and a thread of pale smoke rising from it into the clearing sky. "You did something here," he said. She stood beside him in the cold morning air. "Yes." He looked at the walls, at the snow that had accumulated against them and was now providing in its stillness something it had not been designed to provide. "You used what came," he said, "even the snow." "I reduced what I had to fight," she said. "Whatever reduced it further, I accepted." He nodded slowly. He was looking at the structure not as he had looked at it in September, when it had been a problem he expected to fail on its own terms. He was looking at it as a man who had just spent 5 days inside a structure that had partially failed, watching through the gap in his own roof as the storm moved through his living space, understanding with a clarity that only direct experience provides what the difference between those two structures actually meant. Not in theory, in firewood, in sleep, in the temperature of the air at 4 in the morning when the cold is at its lowest and the fire has burned down, and a person must decide between staying warm and having enough wood to stay warm again tomorrow. That was the difference, not in the appearance of the two structures from a distance, not in the materials or the tools or the labor. In the outcome at 4 in the morning, in the middle of a 5-day storm, in the winter of 1892, on the open Kansas plain, when the only question that remains is whether the system holds. Hers had held. He mounted his horse, which had sheltered in the half of his own structure that still stood, and he turned north. He looked back once at the low mound of earth and snow from which a thread of smoke continued to rise steady and uninterrupted into the morning air. He did not say anything else. He had already said what needed to be said, and so had she, and the smoke rising behind him said the rest. December arrived without ceremony. There was no single morning when the cold announced itself as something different from what had come before. It simply deepened the way a river deepens as you walk further from the bank, gradually and then completely, until the ground beneath your feet is no longer visible, and you are moving through something that has its own rules entirely. The temperature outside the structure dropped past the point where it fluctuated between day and night, and settled instead into a constancy that was in some ways harder to manage than the variable cold of November, and in some ways easier. What does not change cannot surprise you. What does not change requires only that your system be adequate to a fixed condition, rather than responsive to a shifting one. Hattie had built for adequacy. She had not built for comfort or for the appearance of permanence or for the approval of anyone who might ride past and evaluate the structure from a distance. She had built for the specific conditions of this specific place in this specific winter, and as December established those conditions with the finality of something that has made up its mind, the structure responded with a steadiness that she had worked toward, but had not until now been entirely certain she would see. The fire remained small. This was the measure she had settled on as the truest indicator of the system's health, not the temperature inside the structure, which she had no instrument to measure precisely. Not the comfort of the children, which was real, but not quantifiable. The fire. A fire that needed frequent feeding meant the system was losing heat faster than the fire was producing it. A fire that held between additions that maintained its small, steady presence without demanding constant attention meant the opposite. It meant the structure was doing its work. Through December, the fire held. Outside, the situation on the surrounding homestead claims was becoming visible in a particular way. Smoke. Not the thin, pale thread that rose from the opening in Hattie's roof at measured intervals. The smoke from the neighboring structures was thick and constant, rising in dark columns that did not thin and did not pause because the fires producing them could not be allowed to thin or pause. Men who had prepared carefully and stacked their wood in good order in October were looking at their wood piles in December and beginning to calculate forward in a way they had not anticipated needing to calculate. The distance between what they had and what they needed was not dramatic yet. It was a discrepancy of weeks, not days. But a discrepancy of weeks in the middle of a Kansas winter with no road passable and no town close enough to matter is not a small thing. It accumulates. And accumulation is the mechanism by which winter defeats people who have not built their systems around it. Hattie did not calculate forward in the same way. She calculated the interval between additions to the fire and compared it to the intervals of 2 weeks before and 4 weeks before. The intervals were longer. The system was not just holding, it was improving. As the snow continued to build against the outer walls and the insulating effect she had first noticed during the November storm became a permanent feature of the structure's performance. The fire had progressively less work to do to maintain the interior at a temperature that was survivable. This was the thing she had not entirely planned for and was now accepting with the straightforward practicality that characterized everything she did. She had designed the structure to reduce loss. The snow was reducing it further. The environment was adding to the system because the system had been built low enough and shaped correctly enough to allow the snow to do what snow does, which is to settle and compress and become in its stillness as a barrier against the movement of air. She told Amos this one evening while the fire burned between them. She told him not as an explanation of something she had done cleverly, but as an observation about how systems behave when you build them correctly. You cannot always predict what will help you. But if you build with sound principles, the things that happen around your system are more likely to add to it than to undermine it. The snow had not been part of her plan, but her plan had left room for it without knowing it was doing so, because her plan was based on reducing what needed to happen rather than controlling everything that might. Amos listened. He was a boy who listened the way he watched the fire with a stillness that was not passive but active, the stillness of someone who is working while they appear to be doing nothing. He had begun over the past weeks to take ownership of specific parts of the daily maintenance in a way that had evolved without assignment. Each morning he checked the walls. He had found 2 additional gaps since the one he had reported in November, both of them in places where sod blocks had shifted slightly under the weight of accumulated snow above. Both had been small. Both had been caught early before they became paths of consistent air movement rather than mere imperfections. He packed them himself now without reporting to Hattie, first using the same material and the same method she had shown him by doing it herself. He checked the flame each morning before he checked the walls. If the flame rose straight, he moved to the walls. If it leaned, he stood and watched it until he understood which direction the lean favored, and then he went to the corresponding wall and began moving his palm across the sod surface until he found what needed finding. He was 9 years old. He was doing without instruction what needed doing, because he had been present while it was done before him. Wren continued her work at the entrance. Ash each morning spread carefully across the path in front of the blanket door. She had developed her own refinements. She spread it further out now than she had in November, having observed that the ice formed not just immediately at the entrance, but in a wider arc where the snow was compacted by foot traffic. She had also begun banking loose snow against the base of the wind wall Hattie had built outside the entrance, which increased its effectiveness without adding to its height and without requiring any new material. Nobody asked her to do these things. She had watched, and watching had become understanding, and understanding had become action. That was the transmission Hattie had not planned and could not have planned, the one that Edmund had noticed on the morning after the storm, when he looked at Amos and saw something he recognized as the shape of a person learning how to see. January arrived. The cold in January was of a different category than December's cold. December cold is serious. January cold on the open Kansas plain is something that removes options. It freezes the creek solid so that getting water requires breaking through ice with the back of the hatchet each morning. It freezes the ground so that if any repair to the structure requires digging, the ground must be worked with the hatchet rather than the shovel, in short, careful strokes that take 3 times as long as the same work in autumn. It changes the quality of the air itself, thinning it in a way that makes the interior of the structure feel both colder and more sealed, as if the extreme cold outside has pressed itself against every surface and is communicating its temperature through the material of the walls, the way cold communicates through the walls of a glass. Hattie felt January in her hands before she felt it anywhere else. The arthritis that had been a manageable background presence through October and November became in January something that required deliberate management each morning. She kept a piece of cloth she had doubled 4 times and placed near the base of the stove at night, and each morning before she did anything else, she held this warm cloth around both hands for 10 minutes, restoring the circulation and reducing the stiffness enough that her hands could grip and carry and work. It was 10 minutes she could not spend on anything else. She spent them without resentment. The alternative was hands that could not function, and hands that could not function meant a system that could not be maintained, and a system that could not be maintained meant three people in a failing structure in the middle of a Kansas January. So she held the warm cloth around her hands each morning and waited. And then when the 10 minutes had produced what 10 minutes could produce, she began her day. The interval between adding wood to the fire had extended again. This was the thing she measured most carefully and with the most satisfaction, because it was the most precise indicator of the system's cumulative health. In October, the fire had needed attention every 40 minutes or so. In November, after the gap in the north wall had been sealed and the wind wall had been built, at the entrance the interval had extended to something closer to an hour. Through December, as the snow built against the outer walls, it had extended further. In January, it was holding for 90 minutes reliably. 90 minutes meant sleep, not the fractured, alert sleep of a person who knows the fire will need attention before long. Sleep with a beginning and a middle and an end. Sleep that restored something rather than merely pausing exhaustion. Amos had noticed the extended intervals without being told. He had begun timing them in his own way, not with any instrument, but with the rhythm of his own attention, and he had registered the lengthening as a fact about the system rather than a comfort about the situation. The difference was one she had not taught him explicitly and was pleased to see that he had found himself. It was in the middle of January that she did something she had been considering for weeks. One evening after Wren had fallen asleep and Amos was sitting in his usual place watching the fire, she let the fire burn down without adding to it. Not by accident, not through exhaustion or distraction, deliberately. She sat and watched the flame reduce and did not reach for the wood that was stacked against the south wall and did not signal to Amos that this was something he should correct. He looked at her. She looked at the fire. The flame reduced to a low bed of coals that produced heat and light but no visible flame. The interior temperature began to drop. Not precipitously, not in the dramatic way of a structure without insulation, but steadily and measurably in the way a well-designed space loses heat when its source is reduced. A degree at a time. A degree every several minutes, not every minute. Amos pulled his blanket tighter, but did not move toward the wood. He was watching her watch the fire, or what remained of the fire, with that quality of attention that had become his signature, the attention of a person who understands that they are being shown something. She was counting, not seconds, something closer to the impression of time, the felt duration of a person who has learned to measure in intervals. She wanted to know how long the structure would remain survivable if the fire failed completely. Not comfortable, survivable. There is a temperature below which the human body cannot maintain itself through its own heat production. She needed to know how long the gap between that temperature and the exterior temperature would take to close given the current insulation of the structure and the heat already stored in the earth walls and floor. She needed to know this because a system that has never been tested to its limit has a vulnerability at that limit that can only be discovered by approaching it deliberately rather than accidentally. If she waited until the fire failed by accident, she would have the answer, but no ability to use it. If she found it now, she would know the margin. She would know how much time she had if something went wrong, and knowing that was different from guessing it in a way that mattered. 40 minutes after the last visible flame died, the interior was cold in a way that was serious, but not yet dangerous. She could see her breath clearly. The earth walls had released some of what they had been holding, a slow warmth that was not warm enough to be called warmth, but was measurably above the temperature of open air. She reached for the wood. She built the fire from coals, which requires less material than building from nothing, and the flame returned in a few minutes to its small and steady presence. The interior temperature, which had dropped, began to recover at the gradual rate of a well-insulated space receiving heat from a small fire. She looked at Amos. "Now I know," she said. "Now I am not guessing anymore." He nodded slowly. He pulled his blanket down from his shoulders because the fire was already doing its work again. "If something goes wrong," she said, "we have 40 minutes. That is enough time to fix what needs fixing or to make a decision about what to do next. 40 minutes is not nothing. 40 minutes is a resource." He thought about this. "You tested it," he said. "Like the wall?" "Yes." "Like you watched the flame?" "Yes." He looked at the small fire for a while. "Because you need to know what you actually have," he said, "not what you think you have." She looked at him. He was 9 years old, and he had just articulated the principles she had been operating on since the last week of August, more precisely than she had ever stated it to herself. Yes, she said, exactly that. Edmund came in the first week of February. He came on horseback, which meant the path between his claim and hers was still passable, though the effort visible in the horse told her it was not easily passable. He dismounted and tied the horse to the post she had driven into the ground beside the entrance in November, and he stepped inside with the careful movements of a man managing his own cold. He looked older than he had in November, not because the weeks had aged him in any dramatic way, but because the winter had been doing the specific work that winter does to people who are fighting it rather than living within it. The weight in his shoulders was more pronounced. The lines around his eyes had deepened. He was not failing. He was expensive. Every day of this winter was costing him more than the same day would have cost him in a structure like this one. He sat and held his hands near the fire without touching it. He looked at Hattie and at Amos, who was sitting in his usual place. He looked at the walls, which were unchanged in their materials and altered completely in their performance by the months that had built the snow against them and sealed the gaps and established the system in its mature state. "You are burning less than December," he said. Yes, he shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, in the particular frustration of a man who understands something too late to have fully benefited from it. "I am burning twice what I came into winter with," he said. "I will finish what remains by the middle of March." "That is February," she said. "There is time, less than I would like." She looked at the fire. He looked at the fire. "You are not fighting it," he said. "You told me that in November, and I understood the words, but I did not understand what the words meant until I came back from that storm and looked at my own woodpile." She waited. "I was fighting it," he said. "Every day I was fighting it, and every day it cost me what fighting costs. And you were not fighting it, and every day cost you less. Not fighting does not mean not working," she said. "I worked every day, I know, but you worked on the right things." She looked at her hands. The cloth was folded near the base of the stove, waiting for the morning. "I worked on the things that reduced what I had to fight," she said. "That is different from working on fighting itself." He was quiet for a long time. He had been a homesteader for 3 years. He had learned this land in the way that most people learn difficult things, through mistakes that cost something and adjustments made after the cost had already been paid. He knew this land better than almost anyone she had encountered since August. He knew its seasons, its wind patterns, its particular cruelties, and its occasional generosities. And he had come through 3 winters on it by working hard and preparing carefully and fighting the cold with fire and timber, and the determined effort of a person who understood that winter wanted to take everything and intended to resist it. He had never understood until now that resistance is itself a tax, that every unit of effort spent fighting is a unit not available for something else, that a system designed to reduce what needs to be fought is not the same as a system that simply fights less. It is a system that has converted fighting into managing, and management is sustainable in a way that fighting is not. He had learned this from a 64-year-old woman with arthritic hands who had built her house by going down instead of up, by making the earth do the work the walls could not, by watching a flame every evening for 5 months and following it wherever it pointed. He did not say any of this. He did not need to. She knew it, and she knew that he knew it, and that was sufficient. He stood after a while and said he needed to get back before the afternoon light was gone, and she moved the blanket, and he stepped out into the February cold and mounted his horse and rode north without looking back. She stood in the entrance for a moment after he was gone, looking at the open landscape. The sky was clear and the cold was absolute, and the snow covered everything with the flat, even quality that deep winter snow has when no new snow has fallen in several days, and no wind has disturbed what is already there. The world was white and still and enormous, the way the Kansas plain is always enormous, but more so in winter when the grass is buried and there is nothing between the eye and the horizon but distance. She went back inside. The fire was where she had left it, small and steady. Amos was checking the north wall with his palm, moving it slowly from block to block. Wren was folding the blankets from the sleeping corner with the economical precision she had developed over months of doing this in a small space. They did not look up when she came in. They were doing what needed doing the way they had been doing what needed doing since November. Since October, since the first morning that Amos had carried a piece of displaced sod to the base of the growing wall without being asked. The system had grown past her. It was no longer something she maintained alone. It was something the three of them maintained together, each within their own understood role, each attending to the part that had become theirs. That was the thing she had not intended and could not have planned and would not have predicted in August when she stood beside the wagon and looked at the land and made the first calculation. She had intended to survive. She had built a structure and a set of practices designed to keep three people alive through a Kansas winter with the resources available to her. That had been the ambition, sufficient and not beyond sufficient. But something else had happened alongside it. Two children had learned to see. Not just to see the physical things, the gaps in the walls and the ash path and the angle of the flame. They had learned the quality of attention that makes seeing useful. They had learned that observation is not passive, that watching something closely enough is itself a form of work, that the information available to a person who looks carefully at ordinary things is not ordinary. They had learned this not because she had taught it to them in any direct sense, but because they had been present while she practiced it every day for 5 months. And children who are present while something is practiced consistently enough do not just observe the practice. They absorb it. She had come to Kansas with 40 years of absorbed observation, and it had saved her life. What would they do with what they were absorbing now, given 40 years of their own to build upon it? She did not know. She would not live to see most of it. But she knew it was there growing in both of them, and that knowledge was the only satisfaction available to her that had nothing to do with survival. It was in its way the warmest thing in the structure. February was the hardest month. Not because anything went wrong. Nothing went wrong in any dramatic or structural sense. The walls held the roof, held the fire, held its intervals. The snow against the outer walls continued its quiet service as insulation. February was hard because it was long. Because the cold that had settled in at the end of January did not shift or vary or offer any interval of relief. It was simply there every day at the same depth and the same constancy, requiring the same maintenance, consuming the same attention, costing the same daily expenditure of effort and wood and care. The danger of constancy is not the constancy itself, it is what constancy does to attention. A changing situation demands response, and response requires alertness. A situation that does not change invites the relaxation of alertness, the subtle lowering of the quality of attention that is not noticeable in the moment, but accumulates over days into a deficit that only reveals itself when something finally does change, and the response is slower than it should have been. Hattie did not allow this to happen. She maintained the morning ritual exactly as she had from the beginning. Warm cloth on the hands, check the flame, walk the walls, and assess the roof at the entrance point where she could reach the ceiling and feel the surface for moisture. The ritual was not exciting, it was not dramatic. It was 10 minutes of careful attention paid to the same things in the same order every morning, and it was the reason the structure continued to perform at the level she had built it to perform at. Amos maintained his own version of the ritual beside her. On the third morning of February, he found something. A faint white line at the base of the back wall, barely visible in the low morning light from the entrance. He crouched and looked at it and pressed his finger against it and came to find her without speaking, the way he had learned to communicate urgency without disrupting the quiet of the structure. She went and looked. Frost, interior frost, not from moisture penetrating from outside, from the temperature differential at that particular point being sufficient to cause the moisture already present in the interior air to condense and freeze against the surface. It meant the wall at that location was colder than the surrounding sections, and a colder section meant a section where thermal protection was thinner. She went outside with the hatchet and the packed clay. The back wall on the exterior had developed a very slight gap between two blocks, where one had settled fractionally lower than its neighbor under the weight of the winter snow on the roof. Not a structural failure, not even a visible gap from any distance. A hairline difference in the surface level that created at that joint a slightly reduced insulating capacity. She corrected it. Clay packed into the joint, pressed firm with the flat of the hatchet head until the surface was continuous. She went inside and looked at the frost line. She came back the next morning and looked again. The frost line had not extended. Over the following days, it faded as the wall's temperature equalized with the surrounding sections. The correction had worked. The system had been tested at a point she had not chosen, and it had been found and corrected before the test became a failure. She told Amos that finding that was the most important thing he had done since October. Not because the gap was large. Because it was small. Small gaps do not announce themselves. They work quietly over time, doing damage that accumulates invisibly until the accumulation becomes visible as a much larger problem. The discipline of looking for small gaps, finding them when they are still small, correcting them when correction is still simple, is the discipline that keeps a system running at the performance level it was built to achieve. He nodded. He understood. He had been practicing this discipline for 3 months. He had not known it had a name, but he had known it was what she did, and so it was what he did, and in this structure, in this winter, that was sufficient for the knowledge to move from one generation to the next. The first day that Hattie noticed the change in the light was a morning in early March. Not a change in temperature, not a dramatic shift in the character of the cold. A change in the quality of the morning light that came through the entrance. When Amos opened the blanket to check the outer path, it was a light with a different angle, a light that came from a sun positioned fractionally higher in the sky than it had been the morning before and the morning before that, and the accumulation of those fractional changes had become, by early March, a difference that was perceptible. She did not say anything about it. A change in light is not a change in temperature. March on the Kansas plain is not spring in any meaningful sense. It is winter in the process of negotiating its withdrawal, and the negotiation is not straightforward and not linear and not reliable. But the light had changed. Several days after she first noticed it, the fire did not need to be lit immediately upon waking. Not that the fire had gone out. She had banked it the night before in her usual way, and it had maintained its coals through the night as it always did. But when she woke and held the warm cloth around her hands and attended to the quality of the interior air, she found that the air was not at the threshold that required immediate attention. It was cold, but not at the level of cold that had characterized every morning since November. It was a different cold, a cold that had something softer in it. She waited. She did the morning ritual. She checked the flame and walked the walls and assessed the roof and waited. Then she built the fire up a little. She did it not because the interior required it immediately, but because she could feel from the quality of the air and the behavior of the structure over 5 months of daily observation that something in the relationship between inside and outside had shifted. The interior was not losing what it retained at the rate it had been losing it for months. Winter was releasing its grip, slowly, in the way that things with very long momentum change direction, not suddenly but through a series of increments, each of which is almost imperceptible until enough of them have accumulated to constitute something that can be named. The grip was not gone, but it was loosening. She did not say this to the children. She continued the morning ritual. She continued the fire management. She continued the wall checks and the entrance maintenance and the careful daily attention to a system that had not failed because it had been attended to daily for 5 months and would continue to be attended to daily until there was no longer any need. But she knew, and one morning in the second week of March, she rose before the children and wrapped her coat around herself and moved the blanket aside and stepped outside. The air that met her was cold. Unambiguously, undeniably cold. This was not a morning that did not require a coat, but it was a cold that had something different in its character, something that was related to the cold of January, the way a held note near the end of its duration is related to the same note at its beginning, the same pitch, less force. She stood outside the entrance to the structure she had built and looked at the open Kansas plain. The snow was still there. It would be there for weeks more. But at the edges of things, at the southern exposures, at the places where the ground curved toward the sun, there were places where the snow had lost its absolute authority, where it had retreated a fraction of an inch from the grass beneath it, revealing the very edge of the brown and patient earth that had been there all winter, waiting without impatience for the season to negotiate its ending. She looked at the 160 acres of land that were hers, not given to her, not kept for her by anyone, not maintained by anyone's generosity or charity or assistance. Hers because she had filed the claim and paid the fee and then stayed on the land and maintained the claim through the winter with a rusted shovel and willow saplings and 40 years of absorbed observation in the daily practice of careful attention. The homestead law required 5 years of continuous occupation to receive full title. She had been here since August. She had 4.5 years remaining. She looked at the land and felt no particular emotion about the 4.5 years. They would arrive in the same way this winter had arrived, one day at a time, one problem at a time, one correction at a time, each day, requiring only that she do what the day required and not what the year required, because the year takes care of itself when the days are handled correctly. That was the whole of it. She heard movement inside the structure, and then the sound of Amos opening the blanket and stepping out behind her. He stood beside her and looked at the same land she was looking at. They stood there for a while without speaking. Then Edmund came into view from the north, riding at the easy pace of a man who has somewhere to be, but is not rushing to get there. He was following the path between his claim and the settlement road to the east, the path that passed at a distance of perhaps 200 yards from where Hattie stood. He did not stop. He passed at his easy pace, and he turned his head and looked at the structure and at the thin thread of smoke rising from the stove into the March morning air, and at the two people standing beside it. He raised one hand, then he turned forward again and continued east, and the sound of his horse on the frozen ground faded and then was gone. She looked at the smoke. It rose pale and thin and steady against the clearing sky, the same smoke that had been rising from that spot since October, the same smoke that had been visible from distances, that the low profile of the structure itself had not been the smoke that had told anyone who knew how to read the plane that something was alive here, that the system was running, that the fire was small, and the walls were holding, and the people inside were attending to what needed attending to. The same smoke that had risen on a January morning when she had first imagined the story beginning, that thread of gray above the snow that had looked from a distance like something you might miss entirely. You did not need to outfight the winter. You needed to understand what the winter was costing you and reduce that cost systematically. One gap at a time, one interval at a time, one morning of careful attention at a time, until the cost of survival was something your resources could sustain for as long as survival needed to be sustained. That was the whole of the system, not a secret, not a technique that required special tools or special strength or special knowledge beyond what a person accumulates by paying attention to the things in front of them for long enough. The knowledge she had used to build this structure had come from questions she had asked a patient man over 40 years of marriage, stored without intention in a mind that had never been asked to use them. The knowledge Amos and Wren were carrying out of this winter had come from watching her, and what they would build with it in 40 years when they needed it. She could not know. She only knew it was there. Amos went back inside to tend the fire. She stood outside for a moment longer in the cold March air, feeling the particular quality of a cold that was already in its deepest roots beginning to become something else. Then she went back inside too. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and the work was not finished because the season was ending, and the system did not stop requiring attention because the threat was retreating. The morning ritual remained. The walls still needed checking. The flames still needed watching. The intervals still needed measuring. Not because the winter still had its full grip, because this was what it meant to maintain something, not to build it and walk away, not to attend to it in crisis and forget it in calm, but to give it the same daily quality of attention in easy times that you gave it in hard ones, because the easy times are when the small gaps form unnoticed, and small gaps are where every large failure begins. She held the warm cloth around her hands. She watched the flame. It rose straight and steady in the still air of the interior. Small and sufficient, the same flame it had been since October. The same flame it would be until the morning came when she opened the blanket door and stepped outside and felt something in the air that told her the fire's work was done for this year. That morning was not today, but it was coming, and she would be here when it arrived.